I'm Luke Parker. I'm 36, married to Claire, and we have 2 kids. Emma, 8, and Max, 5. I manage marketing at a small agency. It sounds impressive, but most days it's emails and spreadsheets. I've never been the golden child. That title went to my sister Olivia, who's 33. From the moment she arrived, smiling, charming, my parents, Margaret and Richard, never tired of doting on her. I was the quiet one. Mom teased that I worried too much. Dad joked I needed to loosen up. I laughed along even when their barbs stung. Claire always noticed first. "They're crossing a line," she'd whisper. But I kept forgiving them. Blood's thicker than water, right? 18 months ago, Olivia hit a rough patch. She lost her job at a tech startup and split from her boyfriend. Rent piled up. I remember the day she moved back in with our parents. She looked embarrassed. Our family calendar filled with dinner reminders, family support evening. Mom and Dad offered hugs and advice, but no money. So Claire and I chipped in. I sent rent checks. I covered her credit cards. I set up weekly grocery deliveries so she wouldn't have to face a food pantry. It felt right. She was my only sibling. She needed time. Time stretched. Bills mounted. I tracked every transaction in a hidden spreadsheet. But I never spoke up. Claire handled our own finances and never judged. "You're helping, family," she'd say, pouring coffee on early mornings. Last weekend, Claire broke the silence. She held my hand across the kitchen island. "Thanksgiving is coming. Are you sure you want to do this again?" I followed her gaze to the calendar marking Parker family at Mom's next Thursday. I forced a smile. Of course. But inside I felt a knot so tight I could barely breathe. I didn't know it yet, but Thanksgiving would be the spark. It would expose every hidden debt, every silent grudge, and every line I'd let cross for too long. I took a deep breath, grabbed my coat, and headed to the car. I had no idea what waited behind that front door. I pulled into my parents' driveway just as the late afternoon sun dipped behind the oaks, casting long, lean shadows across the yard. The house looked the same, brick facade, shutters painted robin's egg blue, but the air felt charged like static before a storm. I sat in the car for a moment, my hands tight on the wheel, listening to Emma and Max squabble quietly in the back seat about who got to hold the boarding pass I'd found. Claire's gentle voice floated through the rearview mirror. "You okay?" My chest tightened. I wiped a bead of sweat from my brow and nodded, though she couldn't see me. Inside, I felt like a tightrope walker, balancing the love I had for my sister and parents against the ledger of debts they all owed me, debts that weren't just financial, but emotional, spiritual. I'd spent months weighing whether to pull the plug, but today I came prepared. I took a deep breath, steadied my shoulders, grabbed the black folder from the passenger seat, and told Claire I'd call when it was over. As I unbuckled my seatbelt, a sudden gust rattled the windshield wipers, an omen maybe, or just the wind. Either way, it felt like the moment of truth had arrived. I opened the front door to the warm, cloying scent of roasting turkey and cinnamon candles, a scent I'd once associated with comfort, but now felt like a mask over something rotten. Mom stood in the foyer, hands on her hips, wearing that trademark disapproving frown. Dad hovered nearby, brow furrowed, arms folded. Olivia's laugh echoed from the dining room light, careless until she saw me. Her smile faltered. She was still wearing last night's black sweater, hair mussed as if she'd slept in her clothes. "You came," she said, voice laced with surprise. "Of course," I answered, forcing calm. I stepped past them, folder tucked under my arm, feeling the weight of their eyes, expectation, entitlement, or maybe pity. Emma ran past, tugging at Claire's hand, and the moment shattered the stiff greeting. Our children's laughter reminded me of why I'd fought so hard to build boundaries to protect them from the invisible drain of family drama. As I set the folder on the sideboard, the scent of my grandmother's apple pie mingled with the tension like sweetness trying to cover a bruise. I cleared my throat. "Before we say grace," I began, "I have something to show you." Silence fell so hard I heard the tick of the antique clock upstairs. I unfolded the first sheet, a color-coded ledger of every dollar, every debit, Every online order, grocery delivery, rent, check, credit card balance transferred on Olivia's behalf. Mom's expression flickered shock guilt, while Dad's face hardened like leather stretched too tight. Olivia's cheeks burned. Her gaze flicked to the ceiling, then to the floor. I watched their reactions, my own heart pulsing. This folder wasn't just a record of money, it was proof of the emotional labor I'd carried alone. The pages detailed payees, dates, memos, labeled family support, sister care, just this once, spanning almost 2 years. With each sheet I flipped, I felt lighter. For the first time, I spoke not as a brother eager to please, but as a man demanding respect. "I helped because I loved you," I said. "But love isn't an endless checkbook." Olivia swallowed hard. "Luke, you know Her voice trailed. Dad cleared his throat. "This is unseemly," he said. "Family shouldn't be embarrassed like this." Embarrassment, I felt a swell of anger. "I'm not embarrassing anyone, this is accountability." My words hung like a gauntlet thrown. The air shifted when Olivia reached for the papers, trying to crumple a corner in her fist. "You kept track," she whispered. "Because I had to," I replied quietly so I wouldn't start believing I'd lost my mind. Claire stepped forward, placing a hand on my elbow. I gave her a grateful look, her support steeled me. In that moment, I realized the danger of exposing this secret ledger. I risked tearing the family apart forever. But maybe some things deserved to break. Dad's eyes glistened with hurt. He never knew how tangled the web was. Mom's shoulders slumped, her defenses cracking. Olivia sank into a chair, clutching the papers like a lifeline. She looked up at me, vulnerability raw in her eyes. "What do you want?" she asked, voice small. I paused, heart pounding. Do I demand repayment, cut her off completely, or offer one last chance to change? My inner voice urged mercy, but another urged justice. I took a breath, then said, "I want you to see the reality you created and choose whether to own it." Olivia's lip quivered. That question hung between us, heavy as the carved turkey on the table. No one spoke for what felt like an eternity. Then Mom exhaled as if blown over by a gale. "We need time," she said. Dad nodded solemnly. Olivia's tears fell silently, glistening like dew. I gently closed the folder. Risk was now locked in motion. Could I trust them to care for the trust I'd given up? My pulse thundered. I stepped back, hands unclenched. "Take all the time you need," I said softly. "I'll be in the car when you're ready to talk." I left the folder where it was unignorable, but I walked away carrying something lighter, the knowledge that I'd stood up for myself. Outside, the air was cold, crisp against my skin. I slid into the driver's seat, hands sweating again as I let the engine roar to life. Emma and Max peeked out the window, eyes wide, sensing change. Claire settled beside me, her hand finding mine. "How do you feel?" she whispered. I stared at the house, no lights on inside now, curtains drawn, and realized I felt something unfamiliar, hope wrapped in fear. As I backed out, a single leaf twirled across the driveway like a dancer in slow motion, twisting my world with its silent promise of new beginnings. I drove without speaking, the road stretching ahead under a sky bruised purple and gold. My phone buzzed, a text from Olivia. I glanced down. "I'm sorry." No punctuation, no clarity. I let it sit unread. Claire reached over and turned on the radio where a song about reckoning and redemption played. I closed my eyes, letting the melody wash over me. Symbols of the season, a leaf, a ledger, a family meal turned tribunal spun in my mind like tarot cards, each one pointing to a reckoning older than our squabbles. I realized boundaries are sacrifices too. We give up the lie of endless giving to preserve who we are. We pulled into a diner, halfway home, neon sign humming open 24 hours. We sat in a booth by the window. Claire ordered coffee. I asked for blueberry pancakes. The waitress nodded kindly, unaware of the upheaval we carried. I reached across the table for Claire's hand. "Whatever happens," I said, voice low, "I don't regret this." Her eyes shone with pride and relief. The first forkful of pancake was warm, sweet, familiar, yet tasted like a new chapter. I swallowed and let the words come. "I'm scared, but I know I did the right thing." Claire squeezed my hand. In that unassuming diner with a plate of pancakes between us, I realized the greatest risk, truth, had finally set me free. And I knew the next chapter would demand more courage than I'd ever summoned before. When dawn came, I was already at my desk in the home office, the morning light slanting through half-open blinds like long, golden prison bars. I felt a surge of resolve. The pancakes had settled heavy in my stomach, but the clarity they brought still burned warm in my chest. I would no longer be the passive provider or the silent safety net. I opened my laptop and scrolled through the digital evidence I'd spent the past 3 days compiling: bank statements, transaction memos, IP logs, every breadcrumb they'd left behind. My fingers trembled as I organized the files into folders labeled Olivia, Mom and Dad, and Corporate Account. Each click was a small rebellion against the guilt they'd wielded for years. The risk felt enormous. If I exposed every truth, I'd shatter the family facade forever. If I held back, I'd remain their unwitting accomplice. In that moment, the ledger wasn't just paper and pixels, it was a mirror. It reflected how much I'd sacrificed of myself to keep peace, and how little peace I'd ever had in return. My heart hammered as I opened my contacts and tapped Sarah, my lawyer. The call connected on the second ring. I heard her calm voice. "Luke, it's early." I swallowed. I need advice on financial abuse and on restraining orders. My breath caught. "Can you meet me today?" She agreed, and I ended the call with a click that sounded like a gunshot in the silence. Outside, a solitary crow cawed on the power line. I leaned back, eyes closed, and let the risk wash over me like cold water. I had taken the first step, and now there was no turning back. By mid-morning, the sky had clouded over a slate-gray dome pressing down on the neighborhood. I slipped out of the house, kissed Claire and the kids goodbye, and climbed into my car. On the drive to Sarah's office, I passed the elementary school where Emma and Max learned their ABCs. The sight probed my conscience. Did I have the right to drag them into this storm? But then I thought of their laughter, of Claire's gentle strength, and I knew I was ripping them out of a toxic lull rather than dragging them in. The streets glistened from last night's rain, and reflections of neon stop signs shimmered in puddles like warnings. My own sense of justice felt equally mirrored: stop the exploitation or risk being complicit. I parked outside Sarah's building, its modern steel and glass facade cutting a crisp silhouette against the murky sky. Inside, she met me in a narrow conference room. Her expression was professional concern. I laid out the binder, the color-coded spreadsheets, bank printouts, the notarized notice I'd handed my family, and watched as her brow knitted. "This is extensive," she said. "They'll deny everything. You'll need a plan." I nodded, throat tight with anticipation. "I want them formally barred from my accounts. I want financial protections in place immediately." She leaned back. "That requires court orders. It could take days. Are you ready for the fallout?" My pulse spiked. I pictured Olivia standing at our threshold with tears streaming, or worse, rage. Yet somewhere beneath the fear, a new certainty bloomed. Fallout was better than stagnation. I exhaled and met Sarah's eyes. "Let's do it." As I headed back home, I spotted an envelope on the passenger seat, slipped there earlier by Alan. I tore it open at a red light. Inside were crisp bank statements for my parents' mortgage, but also strange documents, an email thread with my dad, and a financial advisor discussing leveraging family capital through shell companies and trusts. One message read, "Luke's Goodwill Fund makes this seamless." My knuckles turned white around the steering wheel. Dad had built an entire structure to siphon funds disguised as brotherly generosity. The twist seared hotter than betrayal. He wasn't an unwitting participant. He was the architect. All these years, I'd believed I was helping both siblings and parents. In reality, I'd been funding a hidden enterprise. My mind raced through every dinner, every holiday card, every "we're so grateful" smile. Each one had been a lie carefully faked over a network of bank codes and legal jargon. I sat frozen as traffic hummed around me. The promise of new beginnings felt poisoned. If Dad was complicit, then Mom, who pressed me about duty and loyalty, had been her enforcer, and Olivia's tears had been rehearsed. A slow tremor of grief and rage coursed through me. I shut the envelope and slid it into my briefcase. My next move would decide whether to expose both parents as co-conspirators. The risk was catastrophic, and yet something fierce in me whispered they needed to taste the consequences they'd engineered. At home, I found Olivia in the kitchen as if she knew I'd return. Steam curled from a half-empty kettle. She looked up, eyes red-rimmed. "Luke," she began, voice pitched between apology and accusation. "I'm sorry for how things blew up. I'm scared." I closed the door behind me and pressed my back to it. "You should be," I said quietly, voice calm but hard. She stepped forward, hands outstretched. "I never meant to hurt anyone. They twisted it, Mom and Dad. If you only knew what they were saying behind your back." My mind replayed Dad's words in Alan's documents. Olivia's fairness claim felt like sabotage. If she'd colluded, her tears were weapons. Yet I wondered if she truly believed the narrative or was covering her own tracks. "Save it," I replied. "I saw the emails. You were all in." Her jaw tightened. "I was protecting them. They told me you'd understand." I stared at her choice flickering crush her under the weight of proof or pull her back from the brink of hopelessness. The kitchen clock ticked loudly, each second a verdict. I exhaled. "Tomorrow I meet Sarah again. We'll secure a preliminary order to freeze all joint accounts." "I'm sorry it's come to this." Olivia's face crumpled, eyes brimming. A single tear traced her cheek. "Please," she whispered, "don't destroy the family." The world stilled on that plea laden with both manipulation and desperate truth. I didn't answer. Instead, I turned and walked away, the kettle's whistle trailing behind me like a muted sob. That evening, Claire and I sat at the dining table, kids at their grandparents' for the night. The only light was a desk lamp I'd wheeled in from the office, casting a pool of harsh yellow. I laid out Alan's envelope, Sarah's notes, Dad's email, printouts, every damning page. Claire looked from the documents to me, then placed her hand over mine. "I always knew something felt off," she said. "But this? It's beyond anything I imagined." My throat went dry. I thought of my parents teaching me to be responsible of the family dinners where I bit my tongue so I could pay for their mistakes. Now it was payback time. But for what justice or vengeance? My reflection shimmered in the polished table surface, eyes tired yet determined. "I want to expose it all," I said, voice low. But part of me wonders if I'm just trading one lie for another. Claire squeezed my hand. "Truth won't feel like a lie." I let her words anchor me. We spent the next hour drafting my priorities: protect our kids, cut off the fraud, spare Mom if she'd truly been coerced, punish Dad if he'd plotted. Between sips of coffee, we drew lines of who stays bound by blood and who gets cut loose. At midnight, exhaustion claimed us. I packed the papers into a folder and tucked it into my briefcase. In the darkness, the house felt too quiet. On the wall hung a family portrait from years ago, smiling faces I no longer recognized. If I pulled the trigger tomorrow, that photo would become history. Before sunrise, I found myself back at my keyboard, drafting the motion to present to Sarah. My fingers hovered over the submit button. I pictured Dad's smug grin, Mom's wounded pride, Olivia's panic. I envisioned the judge stern, impartial, reading my story of betrayal and control. The thought made my pulse stutter. Then I remembered Emma's laughter, Max's bedtime stories, Claire's unwavering faith in me. This wasn't just about retribution, it was about reclaiming our future. My finger pressed down. The documents zipped and encrypted, then sent. A confirmation notification pinged. My heart lurched. Sarah would file them by mid-morning. In a few hours, a judge would see the full extent of their scheme. I closed the laptop and rubbed my temples. The risk now was no longer mine alone, it was theirs. I rose and paced the living room. Outside, dawn broke with a fiery blush setting the sky ablaze. Birds began to chirp, unaware of the tempest brewing inside the white walls of our home. I faced the window shoulders squared to the horizon. Whatever happened next, there was no turning back. A new chapter was opening, and it would demand every ounce of courage I had left. When my phone buzzed before sunrise, I already knew what it meant. Sarah's terse message confirming this morning's temporary restraining order against my parents and Olivia had posted. My heart kicked triumph and dread, tangled in my chest like competing snakes. I lay there, in the quiet half-light, listening to the baby monitor's soft static, and Claire's even breathing beside me, and wondered how we'd wake the kids today without their lives feeling like a crime scene. At 6, Emma would demand pancakes. At 5, Max would crank out a rendition of Jingle Bells incongruously off-key for late November. Outside our bedroom window, leaves skittered across the lawn, reminders of seasons changing boundaries, shifting. I slipped from bed, careful not to wake Claire, and dressed in jeans and a sweater that still carried the scent of her shampoo, a small anchor to normalcy. In the kitchen, I set the table mechanically, counting forks, plates, coffee mugs. The kettle hissed steam like a quiet warning. My hands trembled. Every mug I poured felt like admitting to my own children that our family was fractured deep down. Yet as I set the syrup and butter in the middle, I realized this breakfast was the first real act of protection I'd ever offered them. I looked out at the street through the kitchen window. No cars, no neighbors staring. God, I wished our front door could be as impenetrable as these walls. And then the knock came 3 sharp raps that sounded like accusations rather than a summons, and I knew our morning had just been hijacked. The door barely creaked before it swung wide, revealing my parents and Olivia flanked by a man in a stiff suit holding a professional briefcase. My mother's cheeks were flushed, her posture rigid. My father's jaw was set like a stone slab. Olivia blinked as though waking from a bad dream. The man stepped forward and extended a stack of thick white envelopes. "These are your countersuits," he announced, voice flat but loud enough for the entire block to hear. I felt the floor shift beneath me, a defamation suit accusing me of libel harassment claims, even false imprisonment related to the frozen accounts. My chest tightened. I glanced down at my pancake-laden children, mouths full of syrupy fruit, blissfully unaware. In that moment, I saw the threshold of my home not as a haven, but as a contested border. My mother's voice trembled. "We didn't want it to come to this." Olivia's eyes were wide. "You go too far, Luke." My father cleared his throat as if that could restore order. The risk now wasn't just emotional, it was legal, reputational, potentially ruinous to my career. I closed the door, the lock clicking like finality, and leaned against it, turning the envelope over in my hand. I didn't know if I should laugh or cry. Instead, I tore it open slowly, my pulse in my throat, and prepared for the next wave. By mid-morning, I was at my desk, staring at a screen flooded with notifications. Voicemail from Sarah, stressing urgency, emails flagged high importance, social media alerts tagging me in threads that exploded overnight. Local family feud goes public. Brother betrays family for personal gain. Parker patriarch speaks out after son's vendetta. Comments piled up, some sympathetic, more contemptuous, like fire bombs in my inbox. A college friend's message popped up. "Dude, are you okay? Seen your name trending." My palms sweated as I drafted a careful reply, choosing words that balanced truth with privacy. The American ethos of communal support had twisted into a blood sport where exposing family secrets was equivalent to showboating weakness. My office manager peeked in concern, etching her brow. "Everything all right?" I forced a polite smile and nodded, though I could feel the ground shifting beneath my professional reputation. What if clients pulled out? What if my boss, once so understanding, saw me now as a liability? I closed the tab on Twitter and turned to the window where a lone tree stood stripped of leaves, branches jutting into the gray sky like accusing fingers. I realized that in fighting for integrity, I risked losing everything I'd built outside that house, my job, my friendships, perhaps even custody. Questions if my wife's sanity was ever questioned. Yet in that stark moment, I also understood protecting my children from manipulation was worth any cost. But as I looked back at my inbox, another urgent email from a PR crisis firm landed, reminding me that the battle had moved beyond family court. That evening, Claire and I sat at our kitchen table kids with their grandparents, again going over strategy with a floodlit desk lamp pointing like a spotlight at the documents between us. They'd sent a hamper of toys with a note for Emma, chocolate truffles for Max, a handwritten apology from Mom addressed to Claire. Gifts meant to soften her to break our resolve. My wife's fingers hovered over the apology note. "Please forgive us. We regret any pain." She crumpled it thoughtfully, folding it into a neat square. "This is their play, isn't it?" she asked quietly, eyes glinting. "They think if they sweeten our kids, we'll let them off the hook." I nodded, swallowing a lump in my throat. It stung Mom's attempt to salvage her relationship with my children to bypass me entirely. The truth was, I had always believed family loyalty was sacrosanct, a birthright. Yet here they were weaponizing that loyalty using my own values against me. A symbol flickered in my mind, the family portrait hanging above our mantel at home, a wood frame carved with vines and thorns, beauty entwined with danger. That frame, I realized, was our story. I looked at Claire, my anchor in this storm. We stand firm. No contact until they agree to mediation under court supervision. She squeezed my hand. "We'll weather this." Outside, the wind rattled the kitchen window, and I felt the first tremor of doubt. Could we truly keep them at arm's length without losing more than we'd already sacrificed? The next afternoon, I found myself back at Sarah's office, the late autumn sky casting long shadows through the blinds. We reviewed the filing deadline's memoranda of points and authorities exhibits numbering in the hundreds. Sarah paused over her notes and asked, "Have you considered a settlement offer, a face-saving compromise where everyone signs a non-disclosure and acknowledges boundaries?" My instinct recoiled. Compromise felt like betrayal, to hand back the ledger. Legal, hold harmless, and pretend nothing happened. But the risk of protracted litigation loomed: mounting legal fees, emotional exhaustion, endless court dates. I thought of my parents' frail health, Olivia's struggle to rebuild her life, Claire's mounting stress balancing work and kids. The conflict wasn't just me versus them. It was my belief that transparency was justice, pitted against their belief that family secrets were sacred. That afternoon, I drove home through neighborhoods decorated with festive lights, fake wreaths, plastic snowmen, artificial cheer masking deeper truths. My mind churned. Was a full trial the only path, or could a carefully crafted settlement protect everyone's dignity while enforcing real boundaries? The symbolic wreaths reminded me of cycles: reconciliation, guilt, forgiveness, and then betrayal again. I parked in front of our house and stared at the door, the lock still fresh from the morning's chaos, and realized I stood at another threshold between retribution and resolution. A week later, the day of the mediation arrived. I sat in a neutral conference room, its walls bare and fluorescent lights sleepy across from my parents and Olivia, each flanked by their own attorney. The table between us groaned under stacks of documents, pens, and water bottles sweating in condensation. As the mediator, a judge pro tem, opened with procedural formalities, I watched Dad's posture sag. Mom's lips press into a thin line. Olivia's foot tap a restless rhythm under the table. We began with pleasantries that sounded like echoes in a cavern. We're here to find common ground. I exhaled slowly, recalling the ledger's every line number, the evidence of breach of trust. Then Dad spoke, voice trembling not from remorse, but contrition, masked as self-pity. We never meant to hurt you. We had our reasons, family tradition supporting each other. He gestured at Olivia. She needed support after losing her job. The mediator nodded, scribbling. When I rebutted calmly and with citations, tradition doesn't absolve deception. Support doesn't justify manipulation. I felt the power of truth crack the veneer of their defense. Mom flinched. Olivia's eyes widened, and the mediator paused, pincering his lips. At that moment, I felt the scale tip my inner strength, once bruised by years of insults, roared to life. But then came the twist. Olivia, tears shining, revealed a clause in Dad's shell company paperwork, an unsigned, undated memorandum, implying that family assets could be allocated at Luke's discretion, signed in his name without consent. The attorneys leapt, papers rustled like startled birds. I blinked. That was new proof they'd manufactured authorization. I felt a jolt of vertigo. Every tactic I'd planned now had to adapt. I cleared my throat, braced for the next volley, and realized that in the battle for truth, I'd never been the only soldier. When the mediator called a recess, we all rose, adrenaline still crackling in the stale air. I gathered my folder, now swollen with counters, to their counters, my hands steady despite the storm inside. Olivia stood beside me, her expression unreadable. For a moment, I saw the little girl who once handed me crayon drawings signed "Love Live." But now she stood with her own legal counsel at my side, a reluctant ally or co-conspirator, I couldn't tell which. Mom's eyes locked onto mine, a silent plea or a challenge. I couldn't decipher. The hallway outside was empty, fluorescent lights humming low, and I felt the weight of every choice I'd made to reach this impasse. As I stepped out, the door whispered shut behind me, and I realized the family I'd known had splintered into factions, each believing in a different truth. My pulse pounded. Did I push too hard or not enough? The next session would decide whether we built a new framework of respect or shattered the bones of our once united past forever. And as I paused under the harsh corridor light, I knew the real test of my inner strength was only beginning, because some truths once spoken can never be unsaid. That night, I returned home under a bruised sky pierced by a single street lamp. Inside, the house felt hollow. The family portrait above the mantel remained covered, a silent testament to life's paused. I poured a glass of water, then sat at my desk and opened my journal, a battered notebook I hadn't touched since before all this erupted. My pen hovered for a long moment. Then I began to write the ledger of my own soul, the cracks in the foundation, the risk I'd embraced. Outside my window, a lone leaf clung to a bare branch, trembling in the cold wind. It symbolized all I'd lost and all I might yet save. In those quiet pages, I confessed my fears that I'd fractured my parents irrevocably, pushed Olivia away, risked my children's peace, and maybe even my own sense of self. But I also wrote of hope, that boundaries could become bridges, that love might be reborn from truth. I signed and closed the journal, the final word unfinished, a blank page left for tomorrow. Then I sank into the couch, the weight of the day settling into my bones. Just as sleep began to claim me, my phone buzzed on the coffee table. A text from an unknown number. "Luke, we need to meet. There's something you don't know." My blood ran cold. In the stillness, I realized the story was far from over, and the next chapter might shatter everything I'd fought so hard to protect. I woke before dawn again, the glow of my phone screen cutting through the night's darkness. The message, just 6 words, haunted me. "Luke, we need to meet. There's something you don't know." No name, no context. My heart thudded like a drum in my chest as I stared at that text, trying to will it back into oblivion. Who would send this? Olivia, Dad Alan. My thumb hovered over the reply field, but I couldn't bring myself to write anything. A part of me yearned to ignore it, pretend the storm had passed. Yet another voice, stronger and steadier, whispered that only reckoning would keep the peace I'd fought so hard to build. I shut off my phone, lay back on the pillow, and waited for the sun to climb. When morning light filtered through the blinds, I rose, rehearsed the stainless steel resolve I'd worn like armor, and dressed quietly. Over coffee, Claire gave me that look, concern edged with solidarity. I nodded once, setting my cup down with deliberate calm. "I have to find out what this is," I said. Her hand touched mine, warm reassurance. I grabbed my keys, the black folder of evidence tucked behind the passenger seat, and steeled myself for whatever waited. The world held its breath as I slipped out the door, each step echoing into the next chapter of a story I'd never wanted to write. I drove to the little cafe on Maple and Fifth, a cozy place lit by Edison bulbs and known for robust lattes and crumbly scones. Alan was already there when I walked in, seated at a corner table with his shoulders hunched, eyes darting toward every entrance. He looked up, guilt and urgency flickering across his features. I slid into the seat opposite him, the vinyl squeaking under my weight. Before I could speak, Alan pushed a thick envelope across the table. "I didn't want to drag you back into this," he said, voice low, "but you need to see it." Inside were pages from a corporate ledger, lines of transactions channeling tens of thousands from my business's LLC, not into Olivia's rent or our parents' mortgage, but into a shell corporation linked to a man named Greg Thompson, a known fixer for an underground gambling ring. My breath caught. 2 years of family support funds had been redirected to someone outside our bloodline. I slammed the envelope shut, shock and betrayal coiling like barbed wire in my chest. Why would Olivia or Dad divide it like that, I demanded. Alan shook his head. I confronted him. Thompson told me Olivia made the deal. She got in over her head with gambling debts. Dad covered for her at first, then they turned it into a family contingency fund, meaning you paid for her and her habits. The wood grain of the table looked splintered under my gaze. A fresh twist of manipulation darker than any ledger entry. "I'm sorry," Alan added. "They used you as launderer and scapegoat." My fingertips tingled. Whatever I'd believed about motives or loyalty, it had shattered. I realized the next choice loomed: expose this criminal link and shatter the last illusions of family honor, or protect them from ruin once more at the cost of my own integrity. That afternoon, the blinds in my office cast striped shadows across my desk, as if prison bars reminding me of the trap I'd spent years stepping into. The Thompson ledger sat before me, an indictment of sins far beyond credit card fees. Guilt gnawed at me, not for being duped, but forever believing in their righteousness. I thought of social expectations, the American myth that blood ties outlast all betrayals. But here was proof that duty could become complicity, that unconditional love could translate into criminal conspiracy. My pulse pounded. If I turned these documents over to the Attorney General's office, it would trigger a federal investigation, possibly indicting Olivia and implicating Mom and Dad as co-conspirators. The risk was massive prison sentences, asset forfeiture, my parents' legacy annihilated. Yet another voice whispered, "If you let them skate now, you're no better than they are." I glanced at the framed family photo on the shelf, our smiling faces frozen in happier times, now twisted by everything we'd learned. The glass seemed murky, as if refusing to let me see the past clearly. My reflection looked back, eyes fierce with resolve. I shut the ledger, knowing that tomorrow I'd have to decide whether to summon law enforcement or seize the faint possibility of redemption through a court-supervised settlement. But even as I weighed the scales, I recognized that this choice would not only define them, but also define who I would become. That evening, I faced my parents and Olivia, again this time in my living room, the soft glow of the fireplace dancing across leather chairs. The Thompson papers lay on the coffee table like a clinical autopsy of our family lies. I watched their faces contort, shock, anger, desperate fear. Mom sank into her chair, tears welling. Dad's jaw clenched so tight I feared he'd crack a tooth. Olivia looked away, voice trembling Luke. I never meant... Her confession cut off like a snapped rope. I swallowed hard, voice steady but icy. You gambled with more than money. You gambled with my trust and my business. My children's toys lined the corner, a stark reminder of what I fought for. The moral stakes glowed in the firelight. Was this moment about retribution or rescue? Mom gathered herself. We did what we thought was best, she said. Olivia needed help, and we used the fund to cover something no one else knew about. Dad reached for the Thompson envelope. She was in trouble, big trouble. It wasn't fair to let her drown alone. Their pleas hung in the air like smoke. The symbol of the fireplace, a hearth of warmth turned into witness to betrayal, felt too on the nose. I realized they still believed the ends justified the means, and I knew I had to decide, would I offer structured forgiveness under strict oversight, or would I hand over the ledger to authorities effectively torching the house that was once our shared past? The crackle of flames answered with its own question. Late that night, I lay awake beside Claire, her steady breathing a lifeline in the tumult of my thoughts. The Thompson documents burned behind my eyelids, the dates, memos, coded descriptions of consulting services arrangements. Each line was a tombstone for another bit of trust buried by secrets. And yet, part of me still recognized the blood in their veins. Mom's soft voice when I scraped my knee, Dad's quiet pride when I graduated college, Olivia's hand on my shoulder during dark times. Could I strike a balance, protect them from legal ruin while enforcing boundaries so firm they'd never cross again? Severity warred with compassion inside me. I closed my eyes and imagined two futures, one in which I called the FBI, watched them haul away my parents in handcuffs, and built a new life alone. The other where I structured a pact, a legally binding family trust with clear disbursement rules, mandatory financial counseling for Olivia, and a commitment from Mom and Dad to pay restitution from their own earnings. The two visions shimmered like mirages. I rose at dawn with resolve, crystallizing I would draft a third path, a restorative justice proposal, relying on mediation facilitated by a neutral financial watchdog. It felt like threading a needle in a hurricane, but it was the only way I could honor both truth and blood. I pulled my laptop toward me and began to type, each keystroke carrying the weight of lives that hung in the balance. The next morning, I summoned everyone back to that neutral conference room at Sarah's firm. The mood was electric with tension as Mom, Dad, and Olivia took seats opposite me, their attorneys standing like sentinels. I handed each of them a 3-page document titled Parker Family Restorative Accord. It outlined strict financial protocols, family funds, held in a third-party escrow, mandatory bi-weekly counseling sessions, audited disbursement only upon mutual agreement, and clear penalties for violation up to removal from the will. At the bottom, I'd carved in my own handwriting, signed with the understanding that true accountability builds trust, and that without trust, there is no family. I passed the accord across the table. Silence fell so thick, I imagined it was audible. Dad's eyes darted to his attorney. Olivia's lip quivered. Mom closed her eyes for a moment and inhaled. The mediator leaned forward. "This is unconventional," he said softly. I met everyone's gaze. Our story has become a cautionary tale of exploitation and blind loyalty. I'm offering a lifeline back to each of you on terms that protect my wife and kids and repair what's broken here. It's the only way I see forward without destroying us all. A single light above us flickered as if trembling at the gravity of the moment. Olivia swallowed. I need to think. Dad's attorney cleared his throat. "We'll review this." The mediator nodded. "Adjourned until Thursday," he declared. As we packed our things, I felt a surge of hope tempered by fear. Would they accept this olive branch, or would they tear it apart and leave us more divided than ever? Back in my car, I exhaled slowly, the restored accord in a crisp envelope beside me. The sky had turned a bruised shade of gray, again, rain spatters misting my windshield. Claire's text pinged, "How did it go?" I typed one word. Tentative. Then I opened my phone's camera and snapped a picture of the accord envelope on the passenger seat, my Declaration of Independence wrapped in legal paper. The image felt heavy, a symbol of everything I'd sacrificed and everything I stood to lose. As the wipers swept across the glass, memories of family dinners past flickered across my mind, laughter mingled with half-heard insults, warmth laced with undertones of resentment. I realized that family wasn't just about shared DNA, it was the bonds we consciously chose to forge day after day. Now we all had to choose whether to strengthen or sever them. I started the car and pulled away the cafe on Maple and Fifth, receding behind me like a ghost. Ahead lay the uncertain road, a chance at redemption or a final fracture. And in my pocket, the accord waited for their signatures, their verdict on whether Jackson Parker would stand alone or welcome reconciliation under new, uncompromising terms. The morning the accord returned, fully signed. I woke before sunrise, heart drumming a cautious rhythm. I dressed in the soft gray light of dawn and slipped into the car, leaving Claire and the kids still curled in dreams. The drive to Sarah's office felt surreal, every stoplight a beat in the countdown to freedom or fallout. I clutched the brown envelope, crisp with each signature like a talisman against betrayal. When I stepped into the conference room, Mom and Dad sat side by side, shoulders hunched as if bracing for judgment. Olivia stood behind them, arms crossed, her face unreadable. Sarah placed the envelope at the center of the table. We watched in silence as Dad lifted each corner of the flap, then Mom's neat script, then Olivia's shaky flourish. When my eyes reached my own name beside Claire's, my anchor through the storm, I realized the pact we'd forged was more than paper. It was a declaration of who we'd become. And yet, as the last signature settled, I felt a colder gust sneak through the door, as if some part of the old debt still lingered beyond those walls. We filed out into the hallway, the fluorescent lights humming like distant warnings. I felt buoyant relief, but also a tremor of doubt, had we truly drawn the line or merely shifted its map. Outside, the sky had turned a mercurial slate, turbulent with the promise of rain. I watched Mom and Dad hug briefly, an awkward, hesitant clasp, and saw the old rituals flicker in their eyes, Sunday dinners, holiday toasts, whispered prayers at the bedside. Olivia lingered behind them, head bowed. She caught my gaze and lifted it in a nod that felt like both surrender and challenge. I swallowed. In that moment, I understood that true boundaries don't just sever ties, they reshape identities. I felt my own sense of self solidify, yet also fracture, as if the man who'd arrived at the office that morning was no longer the same one who drove home. As I slid into the driver's seat, the envelope unopened in my lap, I knew the next choice was mine alone, and the road home felt both inviting and treacherous. Home was quiet when I pulled into the driveway, no laughter echoing from the living room, no clatter of toys. I carried the signed accord and placed it on the kitchen counter beside Claire's half-drunk mug of tea. She emerged in her robe, eyes bright with questions. I set the envelope between us and watched as she read each name, each clause, the escrow account, the counseling requirement, the clawback provisions. When she reached the end, she looked up, relief and grief mingling in her gaze. "We did it," she whispered. But I saw the cost in her eyes, the lost illusion of an unbroken family. I wrapped my arms around her, feeling the fragile crackle of change between us. In that embrace, I sensed we were no longer just survivors of a family feud, but architects of a new one, our own. And as the wind rattled the window panes, stirring the empty wreath on the door, I realized that the simplest symbol of unity had become a relic of what once was. That evening, we gathered the kids at the kitchen table for pancakes, laughter spilling over syrup-slicked plates. Emma told me about a playground spat Max insisted on singing Twinkle, Twinkle twice, and Claire smiled warmth radiating like hearthlight. For a moment, I thought we'd crossed into the realm of normal, but then my phone buzzed with an email notification, account closure confirmation, Parker Family Escrow. I opened it to find that all joint accounts were locked down funds, frozen pending disbursement. The language was sterile final. I closed the laptop, gently hiding its glow from the kids. Claire noticed my pause. "It's done," I said quietly. Her eyes flicked between the screen and me. "It is," she agreed, but I felt the weight of that word, done, like a door slamming shut behind us. The hush that followed held both victory and mourning, as if we'd exorcised one set of demons, only to discover another still lurked in the corners. And in that stillness, I understood that the real work rebuilding trust, forging new traditions, was only beginning. Late that night, I couldn't sleep. I paced the living room where the family portrait once hung, now resting under the couch cushion. The frame, carved with intertwining vines, looked like a relic from another life. I poured a glass of water and thumbed through my journal, the one I'd reopened in the chaos. There, I'd written of hope, fear, and the fragile promise of boundaries. On the last page, I'd sketched a door with no frame, an open archway leading into blank space. Suddenly, footsteps creaked on the stairs. Claire appeared in the doorway, her expression unreadable in the lamplight. She stood beside me without speaking, and we watched the quiet house together. In that moment, every unspoken sorrow and every cautious hope pulsed between us. I reached for her hand, feeling the gentle thrum of life in her palm. "We're okay," I whispered, though I wasn't entirely sure. She squeezed my hand, offering faith I wasn't sure I deserved. Outside, the wind sighed through the trees like a soft exhalation, carrying with it the scent of rain and the weight of everything we'd left behind. At dawn, I found an envelope slipped under our front door, no return address, no name. Inside was a single sheet of paper with 2 words scrawled in hurried ink. "Watch your back." My blood ran cold. After all the battles, all the reckonings, this threat felt like a final summons, a reminder that even the strongest boundaries can be tested by fear and vengeance. I looked across the empty house at Claire's sleeping form and realized that our new beginning still had ghosts to face. My heart hammered with a mix of dread and resolve. I could let this threat unravel me, or I could steel myself for whatever came next. As the first drops of rain speckled the window, I folded the note and tucked it into my pocket. The road ahead was uncharted, but I knew one truth above all: I had drawn my line in the sand. And now I would stand guard whatever the cost. Story 2. My name is Leo Adler. I'm 34 years old, and I work as a freelance graphic novelist in downtown Seattle. Last Friday, I received a single-line text from my sister. "Hey, swing by our anniversary dinner if you're free." No invitation, no table assignment, just that throwaway line. My sister, Dahlia Alvarez, 30, has always had a flair for drama. She didn't invite me so much as she mentioned me like a side note. That subtle tone stung more than any outright insult. I arrived at La Scala Bistro at 7:15 p.m. The hostess, Elena Rossi, greeted me with a polite nod. Her dark hair was pulled into a neat chignon. She checked her tablet. No reservation under Adler. She tried again. No luck. She offered a sympathetic smile. "This was more of a pop-in thing," I said, mimicking Dahlia's own words. Elena hesitated. "I'm sorry, there's no seat." Behind her, through the frosted glass panel, I saw the long oak table. White linens, flickering candles. Dahlia sat in the center wearing a deep red dress. Her husband, Marcus Alvarez, 33, raised a glass to her with a grin that was all too proud. My parents, Gerald and Celeste Adler, 62 and 60, sat close, leaning in as if Dahlia had just told the funniest joke in the world. Cousin Felix laughed at something Marcus whispered. I nodded at Elena, turned on my heel, and walked to the bar. The maitre d' gave me the same look, a polite apology. I found an empty stool and sat down. Behind the counter, bartender Javier Cruz polished a row of martini glasses. I caught his eye. We've known each other since he tended the counter at my old university cafe. Javi, I said quietly, send a bottle of the 98 Chateau Saint Rose to table 5 and pair it with their signature truffle risotto. Then slip in the Wagyu sliders. He raised an eyebrow. You're not at table 5. Bill it to Dahlia Alvarez, I whispered. Javi smirked. Coming right up. I ordered a pale ale and tilted back on my stool. The tension in my shoulders eased. I suspected Dahlia was up to something. She never left things to chance. If it was truly their 10-year anniversary, she'd have sent engraved invites. Instead, I got crumbs. That meant a twist was coming. 10 minutes later, I overheard the table gasp. I glanced over. A silver trolley carried the chateau. The sommelier, Johann Becker, lifted the metal lid of the decanter beside Dahlia. He poured until the glass caught every light. Then he placed a dome over a plate in front of Marcus. A moment later, Marcus lifted the lid to reveal Wagyu sliders, each crowned with microgreens. The table applauded. Dahlia shrieked, $2,000, really? Leo? Her voice cut through the low hum of conversation. Silence fell. Heads turned. Nearby diners leaned in curious. I raised my glass. My beer caught the light in little golden sparks. I sipped slowly, savoring the moment. Dahlia stormed over, red dress swishing. Her eyes were fierce like a hawk surprised to see its prey. You're insane, she hissed. I stood. My own voice carried. You told me to pop by. That's exactly what I did. She opened her mouth to retort, but my dad intervened, voice strained. Leo, don't do this. We're family. But not enough family to deserve a seat, I replied softly. Her face twisted. You embarrassed me. I shook my head. I made sure you can't exclude me in a room full of witnesses. She turned on her heel and retreated to her thunderstruck guests. Marcus swallowed hard. My parents exchanged uneasy glances. The maitre d' hovered nearby, unsure whether to intervene. But I paid my tab cash for the beer. I left a crisp 20 on the bar and walked out. No grand exit, just calm steps into the damp Seattle night. At home, I poured myself another beer. My phone lit up a dozen missed calls from Dahlia, texts from Marcus' dad's voicemail. They all said the same thing. You went too far. I let it ring. I brewed coffee. The quiet of my apartment felt like a luxury. That's when Tessa Nguyen messaged. She's my editor at Brightline Comics and one of my few true allies. Tessa, 10:12 p.m. Saw the post, you okay? Me, let's talk tomorrow. I needed sleep more than closure. But I knew this was only the overture. Something had shifted. Dahlia underestimated me. She thought I'd crumble. Instead, I felt a flicker of power. I had the receipts, the restaurant bills, plenty of witnesses. I drifted off to the low hum of the city. Dawn would bring new moves, and I planned to play them all. The next morning, the gray light of dawn crept through my blinds as I lay in bed staring at the ceiling. My phone buzzed with yet another voicemail from Dad, same old lecture about keeping the peace and family unity, and unread texts from Dahlia that grew more furious by the minute. I sat up, heart pounding, wondering when my anger had morphed into something steadier, a cold resolve. I shuffled into the kitchen, poured black coffee into my favorite chipped mug, half the handle missing but still reliable, and ran my thumb over the crack, tracing its silent story. I thought about the way Dahlia had dismissed me the night before, of how she'd circled her precious inner circle like a queen protecting her throne. I realized I'd stepped on her coronation carpet with more force than I'd ever intended. My reflection in the cupboard door was pale eyes ringed with the city's midnight glow. I wondered if I was becoming the sibling I'd always feared, bitter, vengeful, unable to forgive. But forgiveness felt like admitting defeat, and defeat was a luxury I couldn't afford. Somewhere between the last drop of coffee and the voicemail from Aunt Marisol asking if I was truly okay, I made a choice today. I would stop reacting and start acting. I would reclaim my story. I swallowed the final sip, tossed the mug in the sink, and strapped on my coat. Outside, the world was waking oblivious to my private war. As I locked the door, the screen of my phone flashed an unknown number, and I realized I had to answer that call. But something in me hesitated, an instinct I'd never felt before. By mid-morning, I found myself in my studio, a sunlit loft crammed with canvases and sketchbooks that smelled of linseed oil and possibility. I flipped through the latest page of my graphic novel, the one where my protagonist dares to cross a boundary she knows she shouldn't, and I felt a strange kinship. I was writing about risk, yet avoiding it in real life. On my drafting table lay a family portrait in an antique frame. Dad's grin, too wide, Mom's eyes, too bright, Dahlia glowing like the sun at the center, and me standing at the edge, half visible in the shadow. I traced the glass with a fingertip. It felt cool and unyielding. I remembered how Dahlia used to push me aside in childhood photos, elbowing me out of view so she could take center stage. I'd brushed it off, then told myself she was just bold, lauded her charisma even when it evaporated my own sense of worth. But now every slight, every withheld invitation hung over me like a specter. I needed proof, something undeniable. I dug into the drawer and pulled out my laptop, opened our old family group chat logs, and there it was. Dahlia's messages to Mom, Marcus, even Cousin Felix, spelling out intimate gathering and keep it small. My name never appeared. The network of exclusion was explicit. I printed the transcript, stapled it to the restaurant bill, and laid them side by side. The weight of paper felt brutal in my hands. I realized then that I was about to cross a line I couldn't uncross. Late that afternoon, my phone buzzed with a direct message from Fiona Blake, Dahlia's college roommate, and once my friend offering a shaky apology. She'd sent a screenshot of a group chat where Dahlia mocked my pop-in surprise and boasted about how easily she'd minimized the nuisance. Alongside the text, Fiona included a photo of Dahlia in the restaurant captured over her shoulder, her lips curved in triumph, my family's laughter frozen in the background. The image pressed itself into my mind like a branding iron. Social rituals, polite manners, the unspoken rules of hospitality, they had all crumbled under Dahlia's ambition. I scrolled through Fiona's words, feeling both validation and unease. Fiona wrote that Dahlia saw me as the family's necessary ghost, someone who could haunt the edges but never occupy the stage. My chest tightened. For years, I'd clung to the belief that blood meant loyalty, that family ties were unbreakable. Now I saw those ties as threads Dahlia could pull or sever at will. I closed my laptop and looked at my reflection in the studio window where the Seattle skyline merged with my unmade bed behind me, and I realized my evidence had become my weapon, and I wasn't sure I wanted to fire it. Night came, and rain tapped a staccato rhythm on the window pane. I paced the hardwood floorboards, each step echoing in the empty room until the buzzer at my door startled me. I peered through the peephole. Marcus stood there, collar turned up against the drizzle, eyes rimmed red like he'd been crying or fighting. He shifted a heavy duffel at his feet. I buzzed him in. He brushed past me into the living room, dripping water onto my rug. The air between us was taut with unspoken truths. "I need your help," he said, voice low. "I can't go back there." His admission landed on me like a thunderclap. Marcus, the golden boy husband, admitting defeat. I gestured to the couch. He sat, fingers lacing into a tight knot. He confessed how Dahlia's demands had hollowed out his confidence, how her contempt for his ordinary life had made him a ghost in his own home. He slid the duffel aside as if to show me its contents, a single toothbrush, a change of clothes, everything he needed to disappear. My heart thudded. Aligning with him risked exposing my own plans, entangling me in a battle that could destroy more than just Dahlia's illusions. And yet offering refuge felt like justice. We both stood at the edge of her world, ready to step off. As the rain softened into a gentle patter, and Marcus looked up with hopeful eyes, I knew partnering with him could change everything or destroy both of us. I spent the rest of the night pacing my living room, Marcus asleep on my couch, the city's streetlights sketching shadows across his tired face. I stared at the family portrait on my bookshelf, our childhood smiles frozen in time while rain drummed on the window. It felt fitting somehow, the storm outside echoing the one building in my chest. I knew inviting Marcus into my home carried risks. If Dahlia found out, she'd unleash her fury with sharp words or worse, legal threats. But doing nothing felt like betrayal, and I wasn't willing to let her write his story anymore. I slipped on my coat, grabbed my keys, and told myself I'd drive him to a safe house somewhere neutral until he could figure out his next move. As I turned out the lights, I realized I was stepping off the edge of certainty and into something unpredictable. The next morning, sunlight crept through a thin sliver of cloud, and I found Marcus already awake, packing a battered duffel bag beside the door. His gratitude was quiet. Small nods murmured thank you. But I saw something deeper in his eyes, a flicker of hope that I hadn't expected to find. We drove in silence, the radio playing soft jazz until we reached a small cabin I'd rented under a false name in the foothills east of the city. It was modest log walls, a wood stove, but it offered privacy, a chance to breathe. As I unloaded our bags, Marcus hesitated, glancing at me like he wasn't sure this was real. I told him change always feels like a dream until you wake up in it. He smiled, brief and tentative. But the moment that should have been relief felt charged like a powder keg waiting for a spark. Inside the cabin, I spread out my evidence on a rickety table. The restaurant bill, the chat logs, Fiona's screenshots, and a folder of letters Dahlia had sent to our parents praising her own sacrifice while undermining Marcus. Every page told the same story, how Dahlia wielded privilege like a weapon, carving out her path while leaving others in her shadow. Marcus ran his fingers over the printouts, his jaw tightening. Then he said something unexpected. "She's suing me for defamation." My heart lurched. This wasn't just emotional warfare anymore. It was legal. Dahlia could hire the best lawyers and toss our lives into court. We'd built our little sanctuary on shaky ground. I tore my eyes from the papers and looked at Marcus. "We'll fight it," I said, though my voice wavered. "We'll show them who she really is." He nodded, but the tremor in his hands told me fear still lived there, and that ours was a battle we couldn't afford to lose. Over the next 2 days, I transformed the cabin into a war room. I mapped out timelines on a corkboard, connected strings between texts and receipts, and drafted statements Marcus could give his attorney. Every night, I lay awake listening to the wind whistle through the trees, imagining Dahlia's demands. Would she call my parents, hire investigators, turn neighbors against us? The social stakes felt enormous in our circle. Reputation was everything, and Dahlia had once held the high ground. Now I was determined to wrest it back. I started writing my own account, a memoir in fragments, weaving facts with the emotional truth of years of sidelining and belittlement. Each sentence strengthened my resolve. Each memory sharpened the cut of betrayal. By dusk on the second day, I realized that while Marcus fought for his name, I was fighting for mine too, but against an opponent who knew every vulnerable seam. And as I pinned the last document to the board, the door creaked open behind me. Dahlia's silhouette filled the doorway, backlit by the cabin's porch light. Her red hair glinted like embers, eyes wild with shock and rage. "You think you can hide?" she snarled, stepping forward in muddy boots. Marcus jumped to his feet, placing himself between us, but I raised a calm hand. "We're not hiding," I said, voice steady. "We're telling the truth." Dahlia laughed, a sound that crackled like broken glass. "The truth. You're a liar, Leo." She pointed at the corkboard where my web of evidence glowed under the single overhead bulb. "Those are lies, concoctions, and Marcus will pay for slandering me." My chest tightened. The legal threat was real, immediate. Marcus looked to me vulnerable and fearful for the first time. but something inside me snapped into place. I wasn't just a ghost. I wasn't just an afterthought. I was the architect of this reckoning. I stepped forward, closing the gap between us, and said, "Then sue me. Sue him. But know that everything here, every word, every receipt, every testimony is a promise that we won't back down." Her face paled, and she recoiled as if she'd poked a hornet's nest. And then she turned and fled into the rainy night, leaving us alone with the echoes of her fury and the knowledge that the next move could shatter all our lives. That night, after Dahlia's silhouette vanished into the rain, Marcus and I sat at the cabin's rickety table under a single flickering lantern. The map of timelines and receipts lay between us like enemy territory, and in the flicker of lamplight, I felt an unfamiliar, quiet confidence settle in my chest. I realized I'd crossed a line. I was no longer the passive ghost. I'd become the architect of my own vengeance. Yet with that power came a new fear. Could I control the storm I'd unleashed? Outside, the tall pine tree shivered in the wind, its needles whispering warnings as if nature itself judged our uprising. My phone buzzed a single email notification from Dahlia's lawyer titled "Notice of Intent to Sue." My throat tightened. The legal gears were turning, and the next move would decide if we liberated ourselves or buried our lives under litigation. The following morning, we returned to Seattle, the city's steel skyline looming through a veil of drizzle. In the polished lobby of Hawkins and Frey Attorneys at Law, we met our counterpunch, Simone Hawkins, a sharp-eyed partner who made Dahlia's threats feel vulnerable. As Marcus recounted his story, I noticed Simone's jaw set at the word defamation, and I knew she saw an opening. But then she frowned as she reviewed our documents. "Your sister quietly transferred her shares in Adler and Alvarez to a Shell LLC," she said, voice low. "She's stacking the deck next. She'll claim control of the company." A cold knot formed in my gut. Dahlia had weaponized family legacy trading blood ties for boardroom power. The social contract we'd taken for granted, heritage, loyalty, birthright, had been perverted into leverage against us. Simone tapped her pen. "We'll countersue for breach of fiduciary duty," she decided. My pulse raced. We'd risked everything, and now Dahlia had frozen our accounts. The courtroom was beckoning, and with it a public reckoning that could shatter or redeem us. Rain hammered my apartment window as Marcus and I stared at the notice account suspended pending discovery. I rubbed sleep from my eyes and thought of the shattered mirror hanging in my hallway from childhood, its cracks like spiderweb scars. Each shard reflected a fragment of me I'd ignored: shame, anger, pride. Now I placed the notice beside the broken frame and felt the pieces align into a brutal mosaic of truth. With trembling fingers, I poured coffee into the chipped mug I used every morning, watching the dark liquid swirl like storm clouds trapped in ceramic. The steam rose, carrying faint aromas of risk and resolve. Marcus watched me from the doorway, tension etched around his eyes. "This could ruin you," he whispered. I lifted the mug and let it slip through my fingers, glass shattering across the floor. The crash echoed, and I realized that some things must be broken to be remade. I grabbed my coat and keys. Today we would fight back in the public arena, and I could only hope our truth was sharper than Dahlia's lies. That afternoon, I called my parents. On the first ring, Dad's gruff voice barked, "Leo, what now?" I took a breath, picturing the boardroom where my parents once presided over our family business with pride. "I'm restructuring," I said, calm but unyielding. "Dahlia's influence ends today. I've convened the board, effective immediately. Her shares are frozen, voting rights revoked, and all family stipends suspended." Silence crackled through the line like electricity. Celeste's voice wavered. "You can't do this to your sister." I bit back the retort, reminding myself not to become Dahlia. "I'm doing it for fairness," I said. Her loyalty was conditional. If blood means business, then business must mean loyalty. I hung up before they could guilt-trip me again. In the quiet that followed, I pressed send on the board resolution email. As the confirmation pinged on my screen, I felt the weight of consequence settle in my shoulders. Victory carried its own risks. Outside, thunder rumbled, and I knew Dahlia would retaliate, raising the stakes once more. Weeks later, the smoke of legal battles began to clear. Dahlia's lawsuit floundered under our countersuit, her public image tattered like a moth-eaten flag. Marcus found a new apartment sunlight flooding through windows he once thought he'd never own. He sent me a photo of him standing on his balcony, arms raised as if greeting a new life, and I felt pride swell in my chest. Yet each triumph tasted bittersweet. I walked the empty halls of our old family office, now stripped of her portraits, the walls echoing with ghosts of who we'd been. In the lobby, an antique chair sat under a skylight, a throne, now unclaimed dust motes dancing in a shaft of light. I ran my fingers over its worn leather and wondered if revenge had cost me more than I'd gained. The city hummed beyond the windows, indifferent to our wounds, and I realized that power was a lonely dominion. As dusk fell and the office lights dimmed, I stood alone in the silence, wondering if I had become the very force I once fought, and if that battle was truly over.